On a cold Thursday morning in October of 1998, Marlene Aldis stood and watched a crane drop the 30th dead turbine blade onto the pile. The operations manager, Dale Fenwick, laughed and told her the county would fine her. Then she asked him what he'd take to let her haul all 30 away. Fenwick wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, still chuckling, and told her the number without meaning to give her anything at all. $800 a blade. That was the quote the wind farm had gotten from the disposal contractor. $800 for each of the 30 to haul it to a lined landfill 3 counties over, chop it small enough to accept, and log it. $24,000 sitting in a pile of what he kept calling garbage. He said it the way a man says a thing he's said too many times, tired of it, and then he looked at Marlene Aldis standing there in her faded olive canvas jacket with her hands on her hips, and something in her face made him laugh again. "Tell you what," he said. "You give me $1 and you sign a waiver saying if one of these things falls on you it's your fault and not mine and you can have every last one. Save me the trouble." Marlene did not smile. She reached into the left pocket of her jacket, past the fat red notebook, and came out with a folded dollar bill soft at the creases. She held it out. "I'll need a receipt," she said. That was all she said. Fenwick stopped laughing for about the length of time it takes a man to realize he's been taken seriously, then started up again on his way to the trailer to write it out. "Let me tell you about a dead turbine blade, because you need to understand what it's made of before you understand what Marlene saw when she looked at that pile. A blade like the ones on that heap is not metal. It is a shell of fiberglass, thousands upon thousands of glass fibers laid in long sheets and locked into hardened resin, built hollow, built to bend a little in a gale and snap back, built to carry its own weight out 78 feet from the hub and never sag. The engineers who designed it spent years making it light and strong and utterly indifferent to rain, because a thing that spins in Oklahoma wind for 20 years has to be. It does not rust. It does not rot. It does not care what the weather does to it. And when its bearings wore out and its generation dropped below what the wind farm could sell, the blade itself was still exactly as strong as the day it was cast. That was the whole problem. That was why nobody could get rid of them. You cannot burn fiberglass. You cannot pull the glass back out of the resin once it's cured. You can only cut it, and cutting it is expensive and slow, and then you still have the pieces. So they piled up. All over the country, in laid-on yards like this one, the first generation of American wind turbines was coming down, and its blades were stacking up like the bones of something that refused to decompose. Fenwick came back with a carbon copy receipt on a service pad, $1, 30 units, sold as is, and Marlene folded it into the notebook and drove away in her father's flatbed truck with the heater ticking and 30 blades behind her that she now owned and had no earthly idea how to move. She was 31 years old that October. Marlene Aldis had grown up on the 640 acres her family ran in the far western strip of the Oklahoma Panhandle. Cattle mostly, some winter wheat, some milo when the price made sense, land flat enough that you could watch a truck come toward you for 10 minutes before it arrived. The family was not poor and was not comfortable. They were the kind of solvent that meant every dollar had a name before it came in, that a good year paid down what a bad year borrowed, that nothing got bought new if something used would do. Her mother had passed 4 years back. It was Marlene and her father Holly's on the place now, and a hired man in the busy months and the land itself, which asked more than it gave in a dry decade and gave more than it asked in a wet one, and lately had been dry. The barn was the reason any of this had started. The big barn, 40 feet by 80, had a roof that was going. It had been galvanized steel once, decades ago, and the galvanizing had worn through, and the steel had rusted, and the rust had opened seams. And now when it rained hard the water came through in a dozen places and stood on the floor where the hay was, and where the calving pens were in February. Holly's had climbed up in the spring and patched what he could with roofing tar and scrap, and the patches had held through summer, but everyone who looked at it knew it was patching a thing that wanted replacing. So Marlene had called a metal building supplier over in Guyman and had a man come out with a tape measure and a clipboard. And the man had measured the roof and gone back to his truck and done his figuring and come back with a number. $11,400 for the steel, the fasteners, the trim, and the labor to strip the old and screw down the new. He said it kindly. He knew what the number would do. $11,400 was not a number the Aldis place had lying around in October of a dry year with cattle prices soft. It was a number you borrowed, and borrowing against a barn roof in a year like that one was the kind of decision that Holly's Aldous had spent 40 years not making. So the roof kept leaking, and Marlene kept thinking, and Marlene had been driving the highway that ran past the Cimarron Ridge wind farm twice a week for 6 months. And every time she passed the Ladon yard, she looked at that growing pile of blades and thought about what they were made of, and about a barn roof that let the rain in, and about the difference between a thing that had failed at its job and a thing that had stopped being wanted. Most people see a wind turbine blade lying dead in a yard and they see the end of something. Marlene saw a sheet of weatherproof material 78 feet long that a company was paying $800 apiece to make disappear. She had been seeing it for 6 months before she ever pulled in and asked. Now she had 30 of them, 64 miles from home, and $1 worth of receipt in a red notebook, and the long straight road ahead of her going gold under a low sun. She drove with both hands on the wheel and did the arithmetic she always did, the arithmetic of a person who had never in her life had enough money to be careless with it. The flatbed she was in belonged to her father, and it was rated for a load and a length, but not for 78 feet of anything. She could not simply back it up to the pile and drive off. The blades were longer than a school bus, longer than most trailers, oversized load permit long, and she had no permit and no trailer and no crane of her own to lift them. And the wind farm's crane was theirs, not hers, and Fenwick was not going to lend it. She was going to have to figure out how to move a thing that took a crane to make, with the tools a cattle operation kept in a shed. She did not yet know how. She only knew that she would because she owned them now, and a thing you own, bought and paid for and receipted, is the one thing in this world that cannot be taken away from you. She got home after dark. The yard light was on over the barn, and she could see, even from the truck, the dark line where the roof dipped and the streaks of rust running down under the eave. She sat in the cab a moment with the engine off, ticking as it cooled, and then she took the red notebook out of her jacket and turned to a clean page and wrote, at the top in pencil, the single word blades, and underlined it twice, and went inside to think. The kitchen was warm and the light over the table was the only one on. Marlene put the notebook down and got a pencil and started drawing. She was not an artist and it did not matter. She drew the barn from the end, the pitch of the roof, and she drew a cross-section of a blade the way she remembered it from the ones she'd walked past, the curved shell coming to a point at the trailing edge, and then she drew what she'd been seeing in her head on the drive home. A blade, cut lengthwise opened up, would give you 2 long curved panels of weatherproof shell. Cut across into workable lengths and laid on a roof so that the higher piece lapped over the lower, the way shingles lap, the way corrugated steel laps, and the water would run down the outside of the curve and off the eave and never find its way in. 30 blades, 78 feet each, cut and split and lapped, was a very great deal of roofing material for $1. She was still bent over the notebook when Holly's Aldous came in from checking the far tank. He was 63 that fall, tall and lean and slightly stooped in the shoulders, his steel gray hair combed straight back, his tan barn coat buttoned to the throat against the night. He hung the coat on the peg and stood behind her chair and looked at the drawing without saying anything for a while. And then he took his brass folding rule out of his breast pocket, the one that had been his own father's, and he opened it and closed it once, which was a thing he did when he was thinking, the way another man might rub his jaw. "Those the things off the wind farm," he said. It was not quite a question. "I bought them," Marlene said, "all $30. Holly's was quiet. He was not a man who was startled easily, and he did not startle now. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat, and he reached over and turned the notebook so it faced him, and he looked at the cross-section she'd drawn and the lap and the barn. "Wait," he said, "one of those things on a truck. They're hollow, they're fiberglass. A section of one cut down I can lift by hand. 2 of us can carry a full panel." She had thought about this. It's the moving of the whole blade that's the trouble, 64 miles, but once they're here and cut, it's a light material, that's the whole point of it. They're light and they're strong and they don't rust and they don't rot. That's why they made turbine blades out of it in the first place. Holly's opened and closed the rule again. "Leaks," he said. "You lap steel, you got a seam every so often, every seam wants to leak. You lap these, you got the same problem and you got a curved thing, not a flat sheet. How's it lie down? It doesn't have to lie flat. It has to shed water. A curve sheds water better than a flat sheet if the lap runs the right way." She turned the page and showed him the second drawing, the one with the arrows showing the water running down the outside of the curve. "The rain never sits. It runs off, and the trailing edge, the thin edge, I trim that off. I use the thick part of the shell. He looked at that for a long moment. Here is the thing about Holly's Aldous that you need to understand before any of the rest of this makes sense. He was not a man who said no to protect himself from a mistake. He was a man who had learned, across 4 decades and 2 droughts and the interest rates of the early 80s that had taken half the neighbors he'd started out with, that the world is generous with reasons a thing won't work and stingy with the man who checks. He had watched better financed operations than his own borrow to expand into a good year and get caught out in the bad one, and he had survived by a discipline that looked, from the outside, like timidity, and was in fact the opposite of it. He did not gamble. But he had also raised a daughter, and he had watched her all her life pick up things other people were done with, broken things, cast-off things. He had come out to the shed more than once over the years to find her taking apart a seized engine somebody had left for scrap, or steaming the veneer back onto a chair her grandmother had thrown out, and every single time she had put the thing back into use. Most people, he thought, would look at a broken turbine blade and see landfill. His daughter looked at it and saw a roof. He had spent his own life on the other end of that same trade, buying culled heifers cheap because they'd calved late and running them another year until they caught up, buying the quarter with the wet corner nobody wanted and tiling it himself. He knew the shape of what she was doing even if he didn't know the material. Most things, he said, get thrown away before anybody's done looking at them. He said it the way you say a thing you believe all the way down, quietly, not as advice. He'd said it before, over the years, over other things. It was not a blessing and it was not a decision. He closed the brass rule with a small snap and put it back in his breast pocket and stood up out of the chair, and he looked down at the drawing one more time, and at his daughter's face turned up toward him in the light. I need to think about it, Holly said, and he went to bed, and the decision hung there in the warm kitchen over the drawing of the barn unmade. It stayed unmade for 2 days. Marlene did not push it. She had learned a long time ago that pushing her father was the surest way to a no, and that his thinking was not stalling, it was thinking, and that a decision he arrived at slowly, he arrived at fully and did not take back. So she went about the fall work, and she checked cattle, and she read at night, and she waited. On the morning of the 3rd day, Hollies came in from milking the one cow they kept and set his hat on the table and said, without preamble, the way he said everything, "You can use the equipment shed and the borrowed flatbed off the Reinhold place, and you can have the far corner of the machinery lot to stack them. Prove one panel keeps water out through a whole winter, a whole one. If it leaks in March, you strip it before calving, and I hear no more about it." He picked his hat back up. "And you'll cut them where the dust blows away from the house. That resin dust is glass. It gets in your lungs, it stays there." That was the permission. 1 sentence and a half, a condition and a warning, and it was worth more than a page of encouragement because it was real. Prove one panel through a full winter. That was the test, and it was a fair one, and Marlene took it and went to find a way to move 30 78-foot blades 64 miles across the panhandle. The moving of them is a story in itself, and most of it was talking people into things. The Reinhold place had a flatbed gooseneck long enough to carry a single blade if you let it hang off the back with a red flag and drove the empty county roads instead of the highway and went slow. Marlene borrowed it, and she borrowed a neighbor's tractor with a front loader to lift one end while Fenwick's yard crew, for the price of Marlene not making them do the paperwork twice, swung the other end with the wind farm crane that was leaving anyway. The neighbors thought it was funny. Word had already gone around the co-op and the feed store that Holly's Aldous' girl had bought a pile of dead windmill blades for $1, and there was a good deal of amusement about what she meant to do with them, and men offered to help mostly so they could tell the story afterward. She let them. She did not care what they thought they were helping with. Each trip took the better part of a day, 64 miles out empty and 64 back at 15 miles an hour with a blade hanging off the trailer like a beached whale. And she made the first trips herself and figured out the balance point and the tie-downs, and where the county roads had the culverts that would high-center a long load. And she wrote all of it in the red notebook, culvert by culvert, so the next trip would go faster. And while the blades came home a few at a time, she taught herself the material. This is the part the feed store men never saw. Marlene had, sitting on the shelf in the shed, a fat spiral-bound handbook she'd carried out of a dumpster behind the community college in Guyman 2 years earlier, when the vocational program had shut down its composites shop and cleaned out the classroom. It was a materials and composites handbook, the kind they'd handed to students, and it had a coffee ring on the cover and a broken spine, and it was the single most valuable object she owned that fall, and it had cost her nothing but the reaching in. She read it cover to cover, the chapters on glass fiber reinforced polymer, the way the fibers carry the load and the resin holds them in place and transfers the stress between them, the tables of tensile strength that made her sit up in her chair. And what the handbook didn't cover, she got through the little county library, which could borrow from the state system if you were patient, and she was patient. Books came in over 3 weeks, a text on marine laminate repair, a thin technical bulletin on moisture ingress in cured composites, a boat builder's manual with a chapter on laying up and finishing fiberglass. She read them at the kitchen table after Holly's had gone to bed, and she filled the red notebook with what she learned, and slowly the thing she'd imagined on the drive home turned from a picture into a plan with numbers behind it. She learned why the blades were built the way they were. She learned about the spar cap, the thick reinforced spine that ran the length of the blade inside the shell and took the bending load, the strongest part of the whole thing, and she learned that the shell itself was a sandwich in places, 2 thin skins of glass with a light core between them for stiffness, and she learned the thing that would nearly beat her before she understood it, which was that the core and the laminate edges were where the trouble hid. The outer skin was sealed by the factory, gel-coated and smooth and utterly weatherproof, which was why the blades didn't rot in the yard. But if you cut a blade, you opened it. You exposed the raw edge of the laminate and the open cells of the core, and raw laminate and open core will drink water like a sponge given the chance, and water inside a composite in a country that freezes is a slow, patient wrecking crew. The handbook said it plainly in the chapter on repair. Every cut edge must be sealed. She wrote that in the notebook and underlined it and did not, at first, fully understand what it would cost her to forget it. And she learned the honest reason the blades were free, which was the same reason they were good. You could not burn them because fiberglass does not burn, it chars and smokes and leaves the glass behind. You could not bury them cheaply because they are enormous and hollow and take up a landfill's worth of space for their weight, and because the lined landfills that would take them charged by the difficulty. And you could not recycle them the way you recycle a beer can, because once the resin has cured around the glass, there is no gentle way to get the glass back out. The very durability that made them worthless as waste was the thing Marlene wanted. A material that will not break down is a curse to the man who has to throw it away, and a gift to the woman who wants to keep something dry for a very long time. By the 3rd week of November, she had 8 blades home, laid in the machinery lot along the fence where the dust would blow away from the house exactly as her father had said, and she pulled the first one into the equipment shed with the tractor and laid it across 2 heavy sawhorses her grandfather had built, and it lay there in the shed light, 78 feet of it running out past the sawhorses into the dark, curved and pale and impossibly long. A thing that had turned in the sky for 20 years and would now, if she was right, keep the rain off the calving pens for a great deal longer than that. She stood and looked at it a while with her hands on her hips. Then she took out the red notebook and opened it to a clean page and wrote at the top cut plan blade 1 and began, in pencil, to lay out where the saw would go. She did not start cutting that day. There was one thing left to do first, and it was not strictly necessary, and she knew when she got in the truck the next morning that it wasn't, and she went anyway. She drove the 64 miles back out to the Cimarron Ridge wind farm, to the office trailer beside the Ladon yard, and she went in and found Dale Fenwick at his desk with his clipboard and his chewed pen and his laminated badge on its lanyard, and she told him what she was going to do with the blades. She told him plainly, the way you tell a man a thing you're proud of and not ashamed to have him know. She was going to cut them into roofing panels and roof her father's barn with them. The silence lasted about 2 seconds, then he started laughing. It was not a cruel laugh, and this matters, because a lesser man would have made it cruel and Fenwick did not. Fenwick had been running wind farm operations for 11 years, and he had come up before that as a lineman and before that on a drilling crew. And he had spent his whole working life around big engineered things and the men who built and maintained them. And he knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who has seen 100 good ideas fail expensively, that you did not just cut up a turbine blade and screw it to a barn. His laugh was the laugh of long experience meeting something unfamiliar and doing the only thing long experience knows how to do with the unfamiliar, which is to file it under impossible and move on. He wasn't laughing at her. He was laughing at the picture of a homemade fiberglass roof, and he genuinely believed she'd hurt herself or her wallet or both, and the laugh had some kindness buried in it, the kindness of a man who thinks he's watching someone walk toward a hole they can't see. "Marlene," he said when he'd got hold of himself, wiping his eye with a knuckle the way he had that first day. "I'll tell you what's going to happen. You're going to cut into one of those, and the minute you do, you've got open laminate all along the edge. That gel coat's only on the outside. You open it up, you've got raw glass drinking every rain we get, and out here that's not much, but it's enough. It'll wick water into the core, first freeze it'll delaminate on you, and then it's not a roof, it's 30 pieces of expensive trash you can't even burn." He set the pen down. "And say it holds, say it lays down pretty. You got any idea what the wind does to a roof out here? You know what our uplift numbers are on this ridge. We designed turbines for it. You're going to design a barn roof for it in your dad's shed. First good spring blow, the whole thing peels off the trusses and goes to Kansas." He was not wrong about any of it, that was the thing. Every objection he raised was a real one, was in the handbook, was underlined in the red notebook in Marlene's own pencil. The open laminate, the moisture, the freeze, the uplift. He had walked in about 90 seconds straight to the 4 exact problems she had spent 3 weeks reading about. "Now let me pause here and ask you something, because it matters. When was the last time you looked hard at a thing a business was paying money to get rid of, not walked past it? Looked at it and asked what it was actually made of, and what it had cost to make, and why the only reason it was free was that everybody with a truck had already agreed it was worthless. Because that is the whole of what Marlene Aldis did that nobody around her did. She looked at the same pile Fenwick looked at every single working day, and where he saw a $24,000 disposal problem, she saw 30 sheets of the best weatherproof material ever engineered. And the difference between those two ways of seeing was not intelligence, and it was not luck. It was only that she kept looking after everyone else had stopped. She did not argue with him. She stood in front of his desk with her hands at her sides, and she answered him the way she answered everything, short and level and without heat. She told him she was going to trim the trailing edge off entirely and cut only the thick shell. She told him she was going to seal every cut edge, cap it, that the boat builders had been sealing cut laminate for 50 years, and the method was in the books, and she had the books. She told him she'd lap the panels so the water ran down the curve and never sat on a seam. And she told him she wasn't going to screw them to the old trusses. She was going to reinforce the trusses first and through-bolt the panels with backing plates and neoprene washers, and that if he wanted to loan her the wind farm's own uplift figures for this ridge, she'd design to them and be grateful, and if he didn't, she'd get them another way. Fenwick sat and looked at her. The laugh had gone out of his face by degrees while she talked, replaced not by belief. He did not believe her, but by the particular careful blankness of a man who has just heard someone use his own words back at him and use them correctly. He did not know what to do with that. He picked the chewed pen back up and turned it over in his fingers. "You're going to seal every edge," he said. "Every one," Marlene said. "That's the whole job, the rest is just carrying." He shook his head slowly, not in refusal, more like a man shaking off a strange thought, and he did not offer her the uplift numbers, and he did not laugh again either, and there was nothing more to say. Marlene had come to tell him, and she told him. She thanked him for the dollar's worth of blades, and she meant it, and she said one last thing on her way to the door, the thing that closed it. "I'll bring you a picture in the spring," she said, and she went out. She drove the 64 miles home into a low afternoon sun, the empty flatbed rattling behind her, and she did not think much about Fenwick's laugh, because she had a blade lying across her grandfather's sawhorses in the equipment shed and a cut plan in the notebook, and the first cut was still ahead of her, and everything he'd said was true, and none of it was a reason to stop. The wind came steady out of the southwest across the flat land, and the winter wheat lay green and low in the fields, and the barn, when she pulled into the yard, still had its dark dipping line of rusted steel and its rain streaks, and she looked at it, and then she looked at the shed where the blade was, and she went inside to sharpen the diamond blade on the circular saw. The diamond blade she had was worn near the end of its life, and the first thing she did that evening was pull it off and take the good one down from the shelf, the one she'd bought at the hardware in Guyman for $11 because the man behind the counter had said, when she told him she was cutting fiberglass, that a wood blade would burn and bind, and a masonry blade would grind it to powder, but a continuous rim diamond blade would part it clean. She fitted it and cinched the arbor nut and pulled the respirator down over her mouth and nose, the good one with the twin cartridges that had cost her another $19 and change, and she bought a box of replacement filters besides, because the handbook had told her what she already half knew, that cured glass fiber turned to dust is nothing you want in your lungs, that it does not come back out. She did not switch the saw on right away. She stood over the blade on the sawhorses with the notebook and she thought about the shape of the thing, because a turbine blade is not a flat board. It is an airfoil, thick and rounded at the root where it had bolted to the hub and tapering out to a thin trailing edge along its length, and it twists as it runs so the tip sits at a different angle than the belly. You cannot lay an airfoil flat and cut squares out of it. But she had walked the length of it 3 times with the brass rule she'd borrowed off her father's bench, and she had found what she was looking for, which was the wide belly section back of the root, where the shell ran nearly flat across a span of maybe 2 feet before it curved away, and that flat, she understood now, was the panel. That gentle curve was not a defect. Laid across a roof, it would shed water down its own slope, and lapped over the next one it would channel the rain the way a tile does. She was not fighting the shape of the blade. She was going to use it. She started the cut at the belly, easing the saw down through the outer skin, and the sound it made was not the shriek she'd braced for but a low, steady working hum. And the dust came off the cut line in a pale plume that the shed light caught and the southwest wind, coming in under the open door exactly as her father had said it would, carried away from the house toward the empty machinery lot. She went slow. She let the blade do it. She followed the pencil line she'd snapped down the length of the shell, and the panel came away from the airfoil in one long, clean parting, and when it dropped free onto the second pair of sawhorses she'd set to catch it, she shut the saw off and stood in the settling dust and looked at it. It was beautiful. There is no other word she wrote in the notebook, and she was not a woman given to that word. It was a section of shell about 11 feet long and just under 2 feet wide, curved like a shallow trough, pale gray on its weathered top face and glossy white underneath where the factory gel coat had never seen a day of sun. And when she picked up one end of it, she nearly lost her balance because she had braced for the weight of steel, and it came up in her hand like a hollow door. Light, absurdly light for its strength. She set it flat across the sawhorses and put her whole weight on the middle of it, both hands, then a foot, then stood on it, all 130 pounds of her, and it took the load without a creak and sprang back flat when she stepped off. 20 years it had been bending in the sky under loads that would fold sheet steel like paper. 130 pounds of Marlene Aldis was nothing to it. She got out the notebook and wrote the cost down while the numbers were in front of her, because that was a habit her father had drilled into her, that a thing you don't write down the day you spend it you misremember by spring. Diamond blade, $11. Respirator, $19 and change, call it $20. Box of filters, $6. She had the sawhorses free, her grandfather's, and the saw she'd had for years. Bolts and backing plates she had not bought yet and would price out at the co-op, but she'd priced neoprene washers already, 4 cents apiece, and she'd need a few hundred of them, so call that $12. Marine-grade resin she had not bought yet either and dreaded the price of, and a putty knife and mixing cups and a cheap scale, another handful of dollars. And the blades themselves, 30 of them, $1, plus the diesel and the borrowed trailer and the days. She totted what she'd actually laid out so far. Under $50, and she had, lying in the machinery lot along the fence, enough shell to sheath a barn that a dealer had quoted her at $11,400 in steel that would rust the same way the old roof had rusted. She sat with that a moment. Then she wrote the next panel's dimensions at the top of a fresh page and got up to make the second cut. By the end of that first night, she had 4 panels off the one blade, and she had learned things she wrote down, that the cut wandered if you rushed it and stayed true if you let the blade set its own pace, that the flat belly of every blade sat in the same place relative to the root, so she could measure once and mark them all the same, that if she nested the panels right she could take 3 good ones off the widest section, and 2 more off the taper before the shell curved too hard to lie down on a roof. She stacked the 4 panels against the shed wall, curve to curve so they lay close, and she was tired in the good way, and she ran her thumb along the long edge of the top panel the way you run a thumb down the spine of a book you've finished. And she stopped. The edge was not smooth. Where the diamond blade had parted the shell it had left the laminate open, and under her thumb she could feel it, not the hard glassy skin of the factory face but a rough fibrous nap, thousands of cut glass fibers standing up out of a resin that ended raw and porous at the cut. And between the 2 skins of the panel she could feel the light foam core exposed along its whole open length, its cells cut through and gaping. She pressed her thumbnail into it and it was thirsty. She could feel that it was thirsty. It was the one thing the boat builder's manual had told her in the plainest words it owned, that a cut edge is a wound, and she had cut 4 beautiful panels and left 4 beautiful wounds, and she knew, standing in the settling glass dust with her thumb on the naked edge, that something was wrong, and that she had not fixed it yet, and that she had a whole barn's worth of it still to cut. She did not fix it that week. That is the honest way it happened, and it matters because she was not a woman who forgot things she'd underlined in her own notebook. She knew the edges needed sealing. But she wanted first to know that the panels would go up at all, that the shape she'd imagined would lie down on a roof and lap and shed water, and she told herself she would seal the edges before winter really came, and she let herself believe there was time. So she went at the trusses first. The old barn was framed with heavy wooden trusses on 6-foot centers, and Marlene climbed up into the loft with a brass rule and a flashlight and looked hard at them, because she understood, the way Fenwick had understood at his desk, that the danger out here was not the weight of the roof. The panels weighed almost nothing. The danger was the wind trying to lift the roof off. Uplift. A roof out here does not fall down, it flies up, and the load path she cared about ran the wrong way, from the panel up through the fastener into the truss and down into the wall and the foundation, and every connection along that path had to hold in tension, had to resist being torn straight up into a March sky bound for Kansas. So she did not just clean the trusses off. She sistered new lumber alongside the two she meant to test on, bolted through, and she ran a length of steel strapping from the truss down the wall stud to the sill. Hurricane strapping the boat building had nothing to say about, but the county library's thin book on light frame construction did, and she tied the load path to the ground. Then she bolted the first 2 panels up. She through-bolted them, no screws, a bolt with a wide backing plate on the inside of the truss and a neoprene washer under the head on the weather side, so the water couldn't track down the shank, and she lapped the second panel over the first the way a shingle laps, the curve of the upper carrying the rain onto the belly of the lower and down and off. And when she got both of them up on that corner of the barn, she climbed down into the yard and stood back and looked at it. 2 panels of dead windmill blade bolted to her father's barn, pale and curved and catching the low light, and she was proud. She let herself be proud. It looked right. It looked like it had been meant. The rain that told her the truth came in the second week of December, a hard cold rain that blew in on the southwest wind and hammered the panhandle for a day and a night, the kind of rain that found every weakness in the old steel roof and ran it down in rusty streaks. And Marlene went out in her father's barn coat with the flashlight in the middle of it and stood under the corner she'd roofed, and it was dry. Bone dry. The rain drummed on the curved panels overhead and ran down their slope and off the lapped edge in a clean silver line, and not one drop came through, and she stood under her 2 panels in the roar of it and grinned like a fool in the dark, and she thought that fast that Fenwick had been wrong about all of it. It shed the rain. It didn't leak. The system's first real test, and it had passed complete. She went to bed that night about as satisfied as she had ever been. She had forgotten what water does when it is not running off a surface but has already gone into one. She had forgotten the thirsty edge. All through that wet day the rain had done more than run off the top of her panels. It had touched the open-cut edges she had told herself she'd seal and hadn't, and along those raw laminate faces, and into the gaping cells of the exposed core it had wicked, slow and patient and out of sight, capillary action drawing it in past the reach of any flashlight. And by the time the rain quit and the sky cleared and the temperature started to fall, there was water inside her panels where no water was ever meant to be. Then the freeze came. The panhandle does not ease into January. The cold came down out of the northwest 3 days after the rain, and the temperature fell through the 20s and into the teens overnight. And the water that had wicked into the cut edges of Marlene's panels did the one thing water does when it freezes, which is swell. And it swelled inside the laminate with a force nothing in that shell was built to resist, prying the 2 skins apart from the inside along every cut edge she had left open to the weather. She found it on a still cold morning in the middle of January. She'd gone out to check the corner after the freeze the way she checked everything, and she got the ladder and climbed up and put her hand flat on the top panel, and where the edge had been fair and tight in December it was no longer flat. It had risen. Along the whole exposed cut edge the top skin had lifted away from the core in a low blistered ridge, and when she pressed it, it gave, spongy and hollow under her palm where December it had been hard as a table, and she got her thumbnail under the lifted edge and it peeled, the skin coming away from the core in a strip, the core beneath it dark and wet and frost-bright in the cold morning, and she knew before her mind had the word for it what it was. Delamination, the exact failure Fenwick had named across his desk in 90 seconds. The exact failure the boat builder's manual had underlined for her in her own pencil. She had built it into her own roof with her own hands by leaving one job undone. She came down the ladder and she did not go inside. She stood in the cold yard and looked up at the lifted, ruined edge of the panel she had been so proud of in the rain, and for the first time since the laid-on yard, the whole thing looked to her the way it looked to everybody else. 30 dead windmill blades along a fence. $1's worth of garbage a smart woman had convinced herself was worth 11,000. Her father's condition rang in her head, prove one panel through a whole winter, and it was January, and the panel had not lasted 6 weeks. She did not sleep well that night, and this is the one time in the whole of it that quitting was genuinely on the table, and she was honest enough with herself to know it. She sat at the kitchen table after Hollies had gone to bed with the red notebook open in front of her, and the failed strip of skin she'd peeled off the panel lying on the table beside it. And she made herself do the thing she was afraid to do, which was read the failure instead of grieving it. And when she made herself read it, she saw it was not the panel that had failed. The panel had not delaminated in its middle, where the factory skin was whole. It had not failed under load, it had not cracked, it had not blown off the trusses, it had shed the rain off its top face exactly as she designed it to. It had failed only along the cut edges, only where she had opened it, only where she had left the wound bare. She turned the peeled strip over in the lamplight and looked at the dark wet core along its back and the raw fibrous face of the laminate, and she understood, sitting there, that the material had done nothing wrong at all. The shell was as strong as it had ever been. She had simply cut into it and walked away and let it drink. For a while, out on that corner of the barn, the thing had actually seemed fine. It had shed a hard rain and she had gone to bed proud. That didn't last, and now she sat at the kitchen table under the lamp and read the failed edge like a doctor reading a wound, and the more she read it the smaller the failure got, and the larger. Smaller because it was one thing gone wrong and one thing only, and she knew now exactly what it was. Larger because if a single uncapped edge could delaminate in 6 weeks, then it was not a matter of one panel on one corner. Every panel she cut had 4 cut edges, and 30 blades made a great many panels, and a roof full of open edges would not fail in 200 years. It would fail in 5 winters, one edge at a time quietly, and she'd have handed her father a roof that came apart in his own lifetime and proved every laughing man at the feed store right. That was the true shape of it, not a leak. A slow, patient rot built into the whole thing from the day of the first cut, and the difference between a roof that lasted a season and a roof that lasted longer than she'd be alive was the difference between a cut edge left open and a cut edge sealed. So she went back to the handbook, and this time she read the chapter on moisture ingress and repair not as a warning she'd nodded at, but as instructions she needed. She read about capillary wicking into resin-starved cut faces, about how the factory never meant those edges to be exposed and so never sealed them, about how the trade that had solved this exact problem 50 years before was not roofing at all but boat building, where men cut and joined laminate for a living and had learned the hard way, hull by leaking hull, that you never leave a cut edge naked to the water. And the fix they'd worked out was simple in principle and exacting in practice, and it was this: you did not just paint the edge, you sealed the open core and you rebuilt the wound. You cleaned and dried the cut face, and you buttered the open cells of the core with thickened resin so nothing could wick. And then you capped the whole edge, wrapped it, laid a strip of glass cloth wet out with marine-grade resin over the raw edge, and lapped it up onto both faces of the panel and squeezed it down tight, so that when it cured the cut edge was no longer an edge at all but a sealed, wrapped, continuous skin, watertight, and because glass laid over glass bonds into one piece. Stronger than the shell had been before she ever cut it. She mixed her first batch of resin at the kitchen table at close to 2 in the morning, a thimble of it on the cheap scale. Hardner counted drop by drop the way the label said, and she wet out a 2-inch strip of glass cloth and wrapped it around a scrap edge off the failed panel and squeezed it down with a gloved thumb and set it by the wood stove to cure. By morning it had gone hard, and she took it out to the shed where the cold lived and left it a day, then filled a bucket with water and stood the capped scrap in it overnight. And when the hard freeze came again at the end of that week, she carried the bucket out and let it freeze solid around the scrap. And when it thawed, she pulled the scrap out and got her thumbnail under the cap and pulled. If you've followed Marlene this far into a cold shed at 2 in the morning, you already know the kind of story this channel tells, and there are more of them coming, so stay a while. The cap did not lift. The glass she'd laid over the wound had bonded into the shell as one piece, and the water had found no open edge to wick into and no core to freeze apart, and it held. She turned the scrap over in the shed light and ran her thumb down the sealed edge, smooth now, whole now, and she stood there a long moment with the cold coming up through her boots. Then she carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table where the failed strip still lay, the two of them side by side, the wound and the healed wound, and she opened the red notebook to a clean page and began to write the cut plan over again, edge by edge this time, every one of them capped. She started over the way you rebuild a thing you almost lost, which is slowly and without wasting a single motion. The failed panel came down off the corner of the barn, and she did not throw it away, because a woman who had grown up on Hollis Aldis's rule that most things get thrown away before anybody's done looking at them did not throw away her own best teacher. She saved it. She laid it across the sawhorses in the shed, and she cut the good middle of it into fresh panels, and she capped every one of their edges the new way, and the ruined, delaminated strip she kept on a nail by the shed door where she could see it every time she walked in, a small monument to the winter she had learned the difference between a job most of the way done and a job done. Then she went at the whole roof. The work of that late winter and into the spring was the best work she had ever done, and she knew it while she was doing it, which is a rare thing. She had the rhythm now. She would haul a blade in off the fence line on the borrowed flatbed, roll it onto the sawhorses, and measure it once with the brass rule against the marks she'd worked out that first night, because every blade tapered the same way relative to its root, so she cut them all to the same nested pattern, 3 broad panels off the belly and 2 narrower ones off the taper. The diamond blade parted the shell with that long white shriek, and the glass dust hung in the cold light of the shed, and she wore the respirator now without arguing with herself about it, and she got so she could take 5 panels off a blade in a morning. But cutting was only the front half of the work now. The second half, the half she had skipped and paid for, was the capping, and she did not skip it again. Every panel came off the horses and went straight to the bench, and she cleaned the cut edge, and she dried it, and she buttered the open core with thickened resin so nothing could ever wick into it, and then she wrapped the raw edge with a 2-inch strip of glass cloth wet out in marine resin, lapped up onto both faces and squeezed down tight with a gloved thumb, and she set it aside to cure with the wood stove going and the shed door shut. 4 edges to a panel, every edge, every panel. She was slow and she was exact, and she did not once tell herself there was time. Hollis came out to watch. He did not offer to help, which was not his way, and he did not offer opinions, which was mercifully also not his way, but he came out. The first day he stood in the shed door for maybe 10 minutes with his hands clasped behind his back, watching her wet out a strip of cloth, and he took the brass rule out of his breast pocket and opened it and closed it once and put it back and went to the house. The next day he stayed 20 minutes. By the second week he was bringing a folding stool out to the shed and sitting in the corner out of the dust, opening and closing that brass rule while she worked, saying nothing, and she understood that the saying nothing was the whole of it. He was a careful man watching a careful thing take shape, and the longer he stayed the more she knew he was coming around, not because she'd argued him around but because she was proving it panel by panel in front of his gray eyes. They went up through March. She bolted them the way she'd worked out, threw bolts and wide backing plates and a neoprene washer under every head on the weather side, lapped like shingles so the curve of the upper panel carried the water down onto the belly of the lower and off, and she tied the whole load path to the ground, hurricane strapping from truss to stud to sill, because the danger out here was never the roof falling down, it was the roof flying up. By the middle of April the barn was sheathed. 40 feet by 80 feet of dead windmill blade, pale gray on top and glossy white where the panels lapped, curved and lying close and catching the low panhandle sun, and it did not look like garbage anymore. It looked like it had been meant. Then the sky proved it, the way the sky does out there, all at once and without asking. The storm came up out of the southwest on a warm, heavy afternoon in the first week of May, the kind of afternoon that goes green at the edges. Marlene was in the yard when the first stones came, and they came the size of marbles and then the size of eggs, and she got under the barn overhang and stood there while the whole county took the worst hail it had seen in years. It hammered down for 11 minutes. She timed it because she was her father's daughter and she wrote things down, and for 11 minutes the hail came off the green sky and drummed on her curved white roof so hard she couldn't hear herself think, and she stood under it and watched the stones bounce off the fiberglass and roll down the lapped slope and off into the grass, and not one of them broke through, and not one of them cracked a panel. And when it quit as fast as it started, she climbed the ladder into the dripping quiet and put her hand flat on the top panel, and it was whole. Bruised white where 1,000 stones had struck it and rubbed the weathered gray off, but whole. Not a dent, not a puncture, not a lifted edge because every edge was capped. She drove into the county the next morning and the whole panhandle was dimpled. The Larkin place had a machine shed with a metal roof stippled like a golf ball. The co-op steel building looked hammered by hand. Truck hoods, gutters, the church roof in town, every sheet of galvanized steel in Cimarron County wore that hail like a rash, and the insurance men were already driving the section roads with clipboards. And out at the Aldous place a roof that had cost a woman under $200 stood without a mark on it, next to a dealer's quote for $11,400 in steel that would have dimpled just like everyone else's. She sat with those two numbers a long time. She wrote them in the red notebook one under the other, so the arithmetic would hold still and be true. The whole roof, every panel, every washer, every batch of resin she'd mixed at 2 in the morning, every strip of glass cloth, the diamond blade she'd worn out and the second one she'd bought, the respirator and the filters, the diesel, the dollar for the blades themselves. She totted it honest, nothing rounded to sound better than it was. $191 and change. And it had taken the hail that ruined every metal roof in the county without a dent, and it would not rust the way the old steel had rusted, and it was tied to the ground against a wind bound for Kansas. Hollis climbed the ladder himself that evening, 63 years old and stooped at the shoulders, and stood on the roof of his own barn under the last of the light and put his freckled hand flat on the bruised white shell where the hail had struck it and pressed, and it was hard as a table under his palm, and he did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "You were right." 3 words, and it cost him nothing because he had never been against her. He had only been waiting for the proof, and now the proof was under his hand, and he was a man who paid what he owed the day he owed it. He folded the brass rule closed and put it in his breast pocket and came down the ladder, and that was the whole of the reckoning between them, and it was enough. Word travels the way water travels on flat ground out there. Slow and level and finding every low place, and there is no hurrying it and no stopping it once it starts to move. By the time the insurance men had finished writing up the dimpled roofs of Cimarron County, every one of them had driven past the Aldous barn, and every one of them had asked about it. And by June, the story of the roof that took the hail had reached the feed store in town before Marlene ever did. Fenwick came out alone. It was a still morning at the tail end of that summer, months after the hail, and Marlene was in the shed capping edges when she heard the tires on the gravel and came out wiping resin off her gloves. And there was the navy fleece vest and the barrel chest and the sandy gray mustache. Dale Fenwick out of his company truck with no clipboard in his hand for once, standing in the yard looking up at her barn. He did not say anything to her at first. He walked around to the side of it and stood under the overhang where the panels lapped, and he tipped his head back and looked up the long curved run of white shell to the ridge. The same shell he had quoted at $800 a blade to landfill, the same material he had told her across his desk would delaminate in her first freeze. And he stood there under it a long time with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his chin down. She let him stand. She had learned that from her father, that you let a careful man take his time. When he turned around, his fleshy face had gone still, and the laugh lines that bracketed his mouth were not doing any laughing. Whatever he had driven 60-odd miles to do, it was clearly costing him, and you could see it cost him, and Marlene respected him more in that moment than she had in the office where he'd laughed. Because a man who can laugh at a thing and then drive out and stand under it and change his mind is a rarer and better man than one who was right the first time. "I was wrong," Fenwick said, 3 words. No decoration, no softening, no explaining. He did not say the delamination would have happened if she hadn't figured out the caps, though it would have. He did not tell her he'd been technically correct about the untreated edge, though he had been. He just said the 3 words a man says when he owes them, and he let them sit in the still morning air between them. And Marlene, who had waited 2 days at a kitchen table once for her father to say something not much longer, understood exactly what it had cost him to say it. The edges were the whole problem, she said, because she was not a woman to leave a man standing in his own honesty with nothing to hold onto. "You were right about the edges. I just didn't seal them the first time. It's boat building. Marine resin glass cap, lap it onto both faces. Water can't wick a capped edge and it can't freeze what it can't get into." He nodded slowly, and she watched the operations manager come back up in him, the man who thought in load paths and disposal quotes, and she saw him look at her roof a second time with different eyes, engineering eyes now instead of skeptical ones. "I'll tell you something," he said, and he took his time about it. "I've got more of those coming. First generations aging out all across this ridge and 3 ridges east of here. We're retiring blades faster than we can get rid of them, and the landfill's charging us more every year to bury them, and there's other farms in the same spot. Cimarron, Texas County, clear up into Kansas." He looked at her. I could route them to you, free. Better than free, we save the disposal on everyone you take. Then he did the honest thing, the thing that made her trust him for good because he did not oversell it. I'll say this straight because I don't want you telling people I told you it'd last forever, Fenwick said. Nobody can certify 200 years on that. No engineer's going to put his stamp on that number. What I'll say is what I know. That shell is fiberglass laminate built to bend in the sky under load for 20, 30 years and not fatigue. It doesn't rust. It doesn't rot if the water can't get in. You cap those edges right, the way you just told me, and there's no honest reason it won't outlast anything else you could bolt on a barn out here. That's what I'll say. Not 200 years. Durable, rust-proof, longer than steel, that's true, and I'll stand behind that anywhere. Marlene looked at the man who 6 months ago had laughed at her for 2 seconds and then laughed for a good deal longer, and now stood in her yard offering her a supply line, and telling her the exact truth about her own material, no more and no less. And she did not gloat, and she did not make him say anything else, and she thought about a girl who once had to lay numbers on a kitchen table and wait 2 days for a one-sentence yes. I'll take them, she said, all of them. I'll need to know when they come loose so I can bring the trailer. Fenwick nodded and put out his hand and she shook it, resin still tacky on her glove, and he didn't seem to mind. He got back in the company truck and turned it around in the yard, and as he pulled out he slowed and looked once more up the long white run of the roof, and then he was gone down the section road in a plume of panhandle dust. 2 days after that the first phone call came, a man from the Larkin place whose machine shed had taken the hail, asking whether Marlene Aldous would do for his roof what she'd done for her own. She said she'd come look at it. That was how it started, one shed at a time, the way real things start. She drove out to the Larkin place with the brass rule and the red notebook, and looked at the dimpled steel and the framing underneath it, and worked out how many panels the roof would take, and how she'd tie the load path down. And she gave the man a number. And the number was so far under what a dealer wanted for steel that he asked her twice if she was sure. She was sure. She'd written every cost in the notebook. She knew to the dollar what a roof took. The Larkin shed led to a horse barn on the far side of the county, and the horse barn led to a fellow in Texas County who ran cattle and had a hay barn going to rust. And somewhere in there, the co-op called about a grain building, 40 feet across, that they'd been quoted a small fortune to re-roof in steel. She did the co-op building over 10 days with a helper she borrowed off the Larkin place, and when it was done, the co-op manager stood under it and shook his head and said he'd tell people, and he did, because a co-op manager talks to every farmer in the county whether they want him to or not. She kept the red notebook as the master ledger of the whole thing. Every roof got its own page, the framing sketched, the panel count, the material cost, the price she charged, the days it took. And the material stayed nearly free, because Fenwick was as good as his word and the blades kept coming, farms and wind operations paying $800 a blade to be rid of them, handing them to her for the cost of the diesel to haul them off. The real cost was never the shell. It was the marine resin, which she bought by the gallon now and which was not cheap, and the glass cloth, and the diamond blades she wore out, and the labor, hers and then others. But even loaded with all of that, honestly, a fiberglass roof came in at a fraction of steel, and it took the hail, and it did not rust, and word kept traveling on the flat. She began writing the years down in figures because the figures were the only way to see the shape of it. 1999, 4 roofs. 2000, 9 roofs, and the first hired man kept on past a single job. 2001, 17 roofs and a second flatbed of her own, so she wasn't borrowing the Larkin places anymore. By 2002, she'd taken in better than 130 blades off Fenwick's Ridge and 2 others, cut them into better than 600 panels, and put those panels on 29 roofs across 4 counties, and the notebook held every one. She was not getting rich. But she was making a living out of material the world was paying to bury, and there is a particular kind of security in that which she felt but did not have words for and did not try to find them. Somewhere along in there someone else started keeping a ledger she had never asked anyone to keep. It was Holly's. She found it by accident, a school composition book in the kitchen drawer where the receipts lived, and in his careful square hand he'd been writing down what she took in against what she laid out, month by month, the way he'd kept the cattle books his whole life. And at the bottom of each month he'd carried a running total of what the operation was worth. He never mentioned it. He just kept it, the way a careful man keeps track of a thing he's decided is real, and Marlene put it back in the drawer exactly where she'd found it and never said she'd seen it, because some things you leave alone. By the middle of the decade, the thing had a name. She'd put it on the side of the flatbed one spring when she got tired of explaining herself on the phone, plain white letters, Aldous Blade Roofing, Cimarron County, and a phone number. And it was strange to see her own name go by on the highway. She hired her first real employee that same year, not borrowed off a neighbor for a job but hired on for good. A young man named Owen who'd grown up on a failing wheat place and had good hands and no fear of heights and a willingness to cap every edge exactly the way she taught him, which was the only thing she truly required. She taught him the boat builder's rule the first day: you never leave a cut edge naked to the water. He wrote it down. She noticed that he wrote it down and she thought that was a good sign in a person. Now let me tell you about the hard year, because you need to understand what it did to everyone else before you can understand why it did not do it to her. You know what a drought and a cattle price collapse did to leveraged operations in the Panhandle in the late 2000s. You have heard the shape of it even if you didn't live it. The rain quit. 2 summers running the rain quit, and the grass went to nothing, and the ponds shrank to cracked mud, and men who ran cattle on that country had to buy hay from 3 states away and truck it in at a price that ate them alive, or sell their herds into a market that everybody was selling into at the same time, which meant the price fell through the floor exactly when they needed it to hold. And the operations that broke were not the careless ones. They were the ambitious ones, the ones who had done everything the bank and the extension office told them to do, who had borrowed to expand in the good years, bought the next section, financed the new equipment, leveraged the herd against the land, because that was how you were supposed to grow. And when the drought and the price collapse hit at the same time, the debt did not care that the rain had quit. The note was still due, the interest still ran, and one operation after another across Cimarron County that had looked strong and modern and forward-thinking went under, sold at the courthouse steps, the land bought up cheap by whoever still had cash, the families scattered. So what happened to Marlene Aldous in the hard year? She came through it stronger than she went in. Not because she was luckier than her neighbors and not because she saw it coming, but because she had never been exposed to the thing that broke them. She had not borrowed to expand. She had not leveraged a single acre of the 640 against a single roof. Her material had never cost her anything but diesel, so a bad year could not squeeze a supplier she didn't have. She owned her flatbeds outright. She had no note to service, no interest running against her in the dark whether it rained or not. And so when the rain quit, the one thing that could not happen to her operation was the one thing that happened to nearly everyone else's. There was nothing for a bad year to foreclose on. A thing that is paid for is the only thing that cannot be taken away, and everything she had was paid for. And here is the part that has the taste of the whole story in it. The hard year did not just spare her, it fed her. Because when a leveraged operation goes under, it liquidates. And part of what a failing wind-adjacent operation or a broke cattle place holds is exactly the kind of aging infrastructure Marlene turned into money. Blades came loose faster than ever as strapped operations cleared their books and cut every disposal cost they could. And the farmers who survived the drought, the careful ones, the ones like her father who hadn't overreached, still needed roofs, and they needed them cheap and they needed to pay cash and own them clean, because after watching their neighbors get taken to the courthouse over debt, cash and own was the only kind of roof anybody in that country wanted anymore. Marlene could give them exactly that. A roof that cost a fraction of steel that they could pay for outright out of a hard year's thin margin, that would take the hail and not rust and belong to them free and clear the day it went up. Her order book got longer in the worst 2 years the Panhandle had seen in a generation, and she hired a second man to keep up. Holly's was older now, past 70, the stoop deeper in his shoulders and the steel-gray hair gone thin and white, and he did not come out to the shed much anymore because the cold got into his knees. But he came out one still evening late in the hard year, while Marlene was loading the flatbed for a roof over in Texas County, and he stood a while watching Owen and the second man rack the panels, and then he took the brass folding rule out of his breast pocket, the one he had opened and closed 1,000 times while he thought, the one he had carried since before she was born, and he held it out to her. "Keep this," he said. That was all. She took it. She did not make anything of it, and neither did he, but she understood what it was, because there is no other reason a man like Holly's Aldous hands you the tool he thinks with. It was not the rule he was handing her. It was the way of seeing that had come with it, the thing he had spent 31 years teaching her without ever quite saying, that most things get thrown away before anybody's done looking at them. and she put the brass rule in the breast pocket of the olive canvas jacket, where the red notebook already rode in the other pocket, the ledger and the rule now traveling together on the same woman. And she went back to loading the flatbed with the panels that had let her family walk through the worst year the country had thrown at them and come out the far side with more work than they'd had going in. The writer came out in a rental car with a soft city suspension that bottomed out on the washboard of the section road, and Marlene watched him through the shed window pick his way across the gravel in shoes that had never seen a yard like hers. He worked for a materials trade publication, a thin, serious magazine that went to engineers and manufacturers and the kind of people who read the data sheets that come with resin. He had heard about the fiberglass roofs from a supplier 3 states away who moved marine epoxy, and the supplier had said there was a woman in the Oklahoma panhandle buying resin by the pallet to cover barns in dead turbine blades, and the writer had thought that could not possibly be true, and he had driven out to see the thing that could not possibly be true. He stood in the yard where Fenwick had stood and tipped his head back the same way Fenwick had, up the long white curved run of shell to the ridge. "Everyone told me you'd make it sound like a miracle," he said. "You want to know what I actually think it is?" "No," Marlene said. "I want to know what you'll write." He laughed at that, a good laugh, and got out his own notebook, and she liked him a little for carrying one. A farm magazine came a month behind him, a bigger circulation and a photographer, and after that a wire piece that ran in papers she never saw, and for a while there was a low, steady traffic of people driving out the section road to look at a barn. Most of them asked the same question, and the question always came around to the same number, because somewhere in the retelling the story had grown a tail, and the tail was 200 years. She had never once said 200 years. Somebody early on had said it about her, the way people will reach for a big round number when the true one isn't dramatic enough for them, and it had stuck to the story the way burrs stick to a dog. The trade writer pressed her on it hardest because it was his job to press. "People are saying these roofs last 200 years, he said. "Is that your claim? Can you back it?" "No," Marlene said. "That's not my claim and I won't back it, and I'll thank you to write that down exactly." Then she told him the truth, all of it, the way she'd have told Holly's, plain and in order and with nothing left out to make it prettier. She told him a turbine blade is a fiberglass laminate skin built to bend in the sky under wind load for 20 or 30 years and not fatigue, and that the same properties that let it do that make it worth a great deal more dead than the world thinks. It is light, so it does not overload a barn's framing. It is strong along its length, so it carries a span. It does not rust, which no steel roof out there could say after 10 panhandle winters. It does not rot if the water cannot reach the inside of the laminate. But she told him, and she made sure he wrote the but down too, cutting a blade into panels exposes the raw edge of the laminate. And a raw laminate edge will wick water into the layers the way a sugar cube wicks up coffee. And once the water is in the layers, a freeze will split them. And that is delamination, and that is the whole and only enemy of the material. Which is why every edge on every panel she cut got capped. Marine resin, a glass cloth cap lapped onto both faces, the water shut out for good. Cap the edge and there is no honest reason the roof won't outlast anything else a person could bolt onto a barn in that country. So how long does it last? The writer said, longer than steel, rust-proof. Paid for the day it goes up. She looked at him level. That's what's true. Nobody can stamp 200 years and neither will I. But I've got a roof out there that's been through a hailstorm that dented every metal roof in the county and it hasn't got a mark on it, and I've got the dealer quote it beat, and I've got the receipt for the material, and every one of those is a true thing you can put your hands on. Put those in your magazine. Leave the 200 years for the people who don't have to stand behind it. He wrote for a long time after she stopped talking. When the piece ran, it did not call it a miracle. It called it, in the headline, a woman who reads material better than the industry that made it, and it laid the technical case out clean and honest, edges and caps and load paths and the $800 disposal quote turned upside down, and it did not say 200 years anywhere. She cut the article out and put it in the drawer with Holly's composition book. She never framed it, but she kept it. For a while things had actually seemed fine, quiet even, the traffic on the section road thinning back out after the magazines had come and gone. That didn't last. A letter came in the spring on heavy paper, an invitation to speak at a regional gathering that put together agricultural people and materials people. The sort of thing that happened in a hotel ballroom in a city with a convention center, and they wanted her to stand up in front of a few hundred strangers and tell them how she'd done it. She nearly said no. She set the letter on the kitchen table and looked at it the way you look at a snake that isn't moving, and she said out loud to the empty kitchen that she was a woman who capped edges, not a woman who talked into microphones, and she was more than half of a mind to write back that she was obliged but she'd pass. Hollis was at the far end of the table with his coffee. He was slow now and the words came slower, but there was nothing slow about what was behind them. Most things get thrown away before anybody's done looking at them, he said. She looked up at him. You threw away a lot of what you knew before you found out the blades were worth something, he said. Don't throw away a room full of people before you found out what they might do with what you know. She went. She wrote back and said she would come, and the operation that had started with 30 dead blades and a $1 receipt was, by then, known a good deal farther than the Panhandle, farther than a woman who caps edges for a living ever expected her name to travel. She was standing in that ballroom, in fact, telling 300 people about capped edges and disposal quotes, the year the young woman first drove out to the Aldous place. She came in a small, efficient car that took the washboard better than the trade writers had, and she parked it square in the yard and got out with a laptop bag over one shoulder and a notebook in her hand. And she stood a moment looking up the long white run of the barn roof the way everybody did. But she looked at it differently. And Marlene, coming out of the shed wiping resin off her gloves, saw the difference from 40 feet away. It was Marlene's niece. Her brother's girl, grown up now and gone off to school and come back an engineer, materials and structures, 26 years old and pink-cheeked and fair the way the whole family ran, with the same dark ash-blonde hair pulled back off her face and the same level look, and she had driven out from her own life to stand in her aunt's yard because she had an idea and no one else in the family would understand it. Aunt Marlene, she said, I want to show you something, can we sit down? They sat at the kitchen table. Of course it was the kitchen table. The young woman opened her laptop and turned it so Marlene could see, and there were graphs on it, stress curves. A photograph of a small machine, she said, was in a university lab, and she talked fast the way the young talk when they've been holding a thing in for weeks. The idea was this. Everybody knew the roofs held. Nobody could prove how long they'd hold, and that missing number, that 200 years hole where an honest figure ought to be, was the one thing standing between Aldous Blade Roofing and the big customers, the insurers, the county buildings, the people who couldn't put a roof on a public building without a service life number they could point to. But you could test it. That was the thing her aunt had never had the tools for, and the young woman did. You could take a capped panel and put it through accelerated weathering, cycle it wet and frozen and baked 1,000 times over a few months to stand in for a few decades, pull test the edges, measure the delamination if any came, and you could grade the panels. You could put a real documented number on a capped Aldous panel, not 200 years, but a true tested figure with a stamp behind it, and you could publish the method so it could be checked. It's the same thing you did, the niece said, and she leaned forward. You looked at something everybody threw away and you saw what was still in it. I'm looking at your panels and I'm seeing the number that's still in them that nobody's read yet. Same principle, I just want to do it with instruments. Marlene sat and looked at her, and she was not in that moment looking at a niece. She was looking at a woman of about the age she'd been herself, sitting at that exact table, with numbers she believed in and no one yet who believed them with her, waiting to find out whether the person across the table would take 2 days to say yes or would say it clean. Marlene had waited 2 days once. She had sat at this table and laid her numbers down and watched Hollis fold his brass rule shut and walk off without a word, and she had lain awake 2 nights not knowing, and she remembered exactly what that waiting had felt like, the particular thin ache of having a true thing in your hands and no one yet to hold the other end of it. Yes, Marlene said. The young woman blinked. That's it, you don't want to think about it. No, Marlene said. You've thought about it, I can see you've thought about it. What would I add by thinking about it another 2 days except 2 days you spend wondering? She reached over and turned the laptop back around toward the young woman. You'll want capped panels of every age I've got. I can give you ones off my own barn that have been up since before you were in high school and ones I cut last week. That's your range. Test them all. She stood and went to the drawer, the one where the receipts lived and Hollis's composition book, and she took out the trade article she'd never framed and she put it in front of the young woman. Read that on the drive home. He got the technical part right. You build on that, not on the 200 years. The 200 years is somebody's wish. What you'll have when you're done is the true number, and the true number is worth more than the wish because you can stand behind it. The young woman was looking at her aunt with something in her face that Marlene recognized, because she'd once worn it looking at Holly's across this table, and Marlene decided the loop had been open long enough. "You want to know the only thing I really know," Marlene said. "Your grandfather told it to me before I understood it, and I told it to every man I ever hired, and I'll tell it to you." She sat back down. "Most things get thrown away before anybody's done looking at them." The young woman wrote it down. Marlene watched her write it down, in a fresh notebook not yet cracked at the spine, and she thought that was a good sign in a person. And then the two of them got up and walked out into the yard and stood under the long white run of the barn roof that had taken the hail, the aunt who read material with her hands and the niece who would read it with instruments. And above them, the fiberglass held the way it had held every year since Marlene bolted the first cap panels to those two reinforced trusses. Held against the sun and the freeze and the wind that never quit out there, and it did not rust and it did not rot, and the water could not get into what she had capped. It is still up there. That is the plain fact of it, and there is not much to add to a plain fact except to say it clearly. There was a pile of 30 dead fiberglass blades in a laid-on yard 64 miles from the Aldous place, and a wind farm was paying $800 a blade to bury them, and a woman drove out and hauled them all home for $1 and a signature on a liability waiver, and the county thought she'd bought herself a fine waiting to happen. Count what came of it. A barn roof 40 feet by 80 that a dealer wanted $11,400 to cover in steel, covered instead in capped shell for the price of resin and glass cloth and diamond blades and her own 2 hands. An operation with her name on the side of the flatbed. Roofs across 3 counties and into a 4th, hundreds of them, sheds and barns and grain buildings and a co-op, every one of them cheaper than steel, and every one of them paid for outright by people who'd watched their neighbors get taken to the courthouse over debt, and wanted no part of owing anybody anything ever again. A father who kept a secret ledger in a school composition book because he decided the thing was real. A young woman with a laptop who would finally put the true number on it. She hauled home 30 dead blades. They called it a fine waiting to happen. The hail came. The metal roofs dented. The fiberglass held. That is the shape of it, and the shape carries the whole meaning if you turn it right, because the blades were never junk. They were engineered, worked, and proven, built to bend in the sky under load for 30 years and not fail, and they were free for exactly one reason, which is that everyone who owned them had stopped seeing them. The difference between scrap and material was never in the material. It was in who was looking. And a roof that is paid for the day it goes up is the one roof a drought cannot foreclose and a bad year cannot take and a bank cannot call, because a thing that is paid for is the only thing that cannot be taken away. Marlene never said any of that out loud. She was not a woman who said her own point. She let the roof say it. The brass folding rule still rides in the breast pocket of the olive canvas jacket, opened and closed 100 times a day now by her hands instead of Holly's, worked smooth at the hinge. And the fat spiral notebook with the cracked red cover rides in the other pocket, its pages gone soft as cloth, every roof still written in it, framing sketched and panels counted in cost to the dollar, because a thing that isn't written down isn't real, and she has never once stopped writing it down. The rule reads the world. The notebook keeps the account of what the world gave up before it was done looking. She carries them both, every day, out to the shed. So here is the only thing I'll ask of you, and then I'll leave you to it. There is a business somewhere near you right now that is paying money to get rid of something. A machine shop with a scrap pile. A bottling plant filling a dumpster. A wind farm with a laid-on yard full of dead white blades and a disposal quoted dreads. Whatever it is, someone worked it and engineered it and proved it, and it is free or nearly free for one reason only, which is that everyone who owns it has stopped looking at it. Go look at it. You might be done before you've started. Most people are. But most things get thrown away before anybody's done looking at them. You know what a drought and a cattle price collapse did to leveraged operations in the Panhandle in the late 2000s. You have seen the shape of it even if you never lived out there, because it is the oldest shape in that country and it comes around like weather. A man borrows to grow because growing is what everybody tells him strength looks like, and he signs the note against the land or the herd or the new equipment, and for a few good years the numbers hold and he feels like the smartest man at the co-op counter. Then the rain quits. Then the grass browns off and stays browned off through a whole summer and into the next, and the cattle come off thin, and the same week they come off thin the price breaks. So a man is selling light animals into a falling market to make a note he took out when the animals were fat and the market was high. That is what happened across Cimarron County in those years. Not to one operation, to dozens. The auction notices ran in the little paper the way obituaries run, a column of them at a time, and folks read them the same way, quiet, doing the arithmetic in their heads of who was next. Marlene read them too at the kitchen table, and she knew most of the names. She had roofed sheds for a good many of them, and here is the thing the drought did to Marlene Aldis. Nothing. It did nothing to her. The rain quit on her land the same as it quit on everyone's. Her grass browned off. Her father's cattle came off thin that fall and sold cheap the same as her neighbors, and that hurt. That was real money gone, and there were lean months at the Aldis place same as everywhere. But the difference, the whole difference, the one that decided who kept their land and who walked into the courthouse, was that Marlene owed nobody anything. She had never signed a note to grow the roofing. She could not have because there was nothing to borrow against. Her raw material had cost her $1 and a signature. Her tools had cost her a couple $100 over a first winter bought outright. Every roof she had ever put up she had put up for the price of resin and cloth, paid as she went, and every dollar that came back clean, owing to no one. When the market broke, there was no note to make. There was no bank with her land in a drawer. The risk that reached out and took her neighbors by the throat that year simply could not find her, because she had never once put herself where it could reach. That is not luck. Turn that over carefully, because the story wants you to think it's luck, and it is not. It is the exact reverse of luck. It is what happens when a person builds something out of what is already paid for. And now the part that is almost too neat to be true, except that it is true because that is how flat country works. The hard year fed her. When an operation goes under, it liquidates. Everything gets sold or scrapped or hauled off. And among the things that got hauled off in those years, out at Cimarron Ridge and at 2 other wind farms that had gone up across the line in the years since, were more dead blades. The first generation of turbines was aging out all across that country by then, and the disposal problem that had put 30 blades in Marlene's flatbed for $1 had not gotten smaller. It had gotten larger. There were laid-on yards from Oklahoma to Kansas with rows of white shells stacked and waiting for somebody to pay $800 apiece to bury them. Somebody, by then, did not want to pay it. Somebody, by then, knew a woman who would take them off his hands. So in the leanest year that country had seen in a generation, the material came to Marlene cheaper and more plentiful than it ever had, and the customers came thicker too, because a farmer watching his neighbor lose everything to a note does not want a roof he has to finance. He wants a roof he can pay for on Saturday and never think about again. He wants exactly what Marlene sold. The very fear that the hard year put into people was the thing that sent them out the section road to her shed. Hollis watched all of this from the porch, slower every season, and he said little about it because saying little was what he did. But there was one afternoon that fall, the auction column heavy in the paper on the table between them, when he took the brass folding rule out of the breast pocket of his barn coat, the one he had opened and closed 100 times while he thought, the one Marlene had watched him fold shut the night she first laid her numbers down. He set it on the table and pushed it across to her. "You use it more than I do now," he said. That was all. He did not say what it meant. He did not have to. She picked it up and put it in her own pocket, and she has carried it every day since. The operation came out of the hard year bigger than it went in. Not because Marlene had gambled and won, but because she had built the one kind of thing that a bad year cannot break. A thing with no note on it, made of material the bad year itself kept delivering to her door. When the rain finally came back and the county started the long, slow business of counting who was left, the name on the side of her flatbed was still there, and it was on more barns than before. For a while things had actually seemed fine, quiet even, the county healing over in that patient way flat country heals. That didn't last, but this time it didn't last in a good direction, because that is when the outside world found her. The trade writer came out in a rental car with a soft city suspension, and you have heard how that went, and after him the farm magazine and the wire piece, and the low, steady traffic of people driving the section road to look at a barn. You have heard what he pressed her on and what she refused to inflate. You have heard her lay the whole honest case out plain, the light, strong, rust-proof shell, the raw edge that wicks water, the cap that shuts it out for good, the true durable roof, and the 200 years she would never claim. He got it right when he wrote it. She kept the clipping in the drawer and never framed it. And you have heard about the letter that came in the spring on heavy paper, the invitation to stand up in a hotel ballroom in a city with a convention center and tell a few hundred strangers how she'd done it. You have heard how she nearly wrote back and said she'd pass, a woman who capped edges and not a woman who talked into microphones. And you have heard what Holly said to her from the far end of the table, slower now but with nothing slow behind it. Most things get thrown away before anybody's done looking at them. Don't throw away a room full of people before you've found out what they might do with what you know. She went. She wrote back and said she would come. The operation that had started with 30 dead blades and a $1 receipt was, by then, known a good deal farther than the Panhandle. She was standing in that ballroom, in fact, the year the young woman first drove out to the Aldous place, and you have heard how that went too. The small, efficient car that took the washboard better than the writers had. The laptop bag over one shoulder and the notebook in her hand. The way she stood in the yard and looked up the long white run of the barn roof the way everybody did, but looked at it differently, and how Marlene saw the difference from 40 feet away. You have heard that it was her niece, her brother's girl, grown up and gone off to school and come back an engineer, 26 years old and fair the way the whole family ran, with the same dark ash blonde hair and the same level look. You have heard them sit down at the kitchen table, because of course it was the kitchen table. You have heard the idea she carried, the one that built on everything Marlene had done and reached past it, the accelerated weathering and the pull tests and the true documented service life number that would finally fill the hole where the 200 years had been. The thing Marlene had never had the instruments for. The thing this young woman did, and you have heard what Marlene said. Yes. Clean the first time, no 2 days of waiting, because she had done the waiting herself once at that same table, and she remembered exactly the thin ache of it, and she would not put another person through 2 days of wondering when she already knew the answer. You have heard her close the loop the only way she knew how, sitting back down and telling the young woman the one thing she really knew, the thing Holly's told her before she understood it. Most things get thrown away before anybody's done looking at them. You have heard the young woman write it down in a fresh notebook not yet cracked at the spine, and you have heard the two of them walk out into the yard and stand under the long white run of the roof that took the hail, the aunt who read material with her hands and the niece who would read it with instruments. It is still up there. That is the plain fact of it, and there is not much to add to a plain fact except to say it clearly. There was a pile of 30 dead fiberglass blades in a laid-on yard 64 miles from the Aldous place, and a wind farm was paying $800 a blade to bury them, and a woman drove out and hauled them all home for $1 and a signature, and the county thought she'd bought herself a fine waiting to happen. Count what came of it. A barn roof 40 feet by 80 that a dealer wanted $11,400 to cover in steel, covered instead in capped shell for the price of resin and glass cloth and diamond blades and her own 2 hands. An operation with her name on the side of the flatbed. Roofs across 3 counties and into a 4th, hundreds of them, sheds and barns and grain buildings and a co-op, every one of them cheaper than steel, and every one paid for outright by people who wanted no part of owing anybody anything ever again. A father who kept a secret ledger in a school composition book because he decided the thing was real. A young woman with a laptop who would finally put the true number on it. A brass folding rule that changed pockets one autumn without a word. She hauled home 30 dead blades. They called it a fine waiting to happen. The hail came. The metal roofs dented. The fiberglass held. That is the shape of it, and the shape carries the whole meaning if you turn it right because the blades were never junk. They were engineered, worked, and proven, built to bend in the sky under load for 30 years and not fail, and they were free for exactly one reason, which is that everyone who owned them had stopped seeing them. The difference between scrap and material was never in the material. It was in who was looking. And a roof that is paid for the day it goes up is the one roof a drought cannot foreclose and a bank cannot call, because a thing that is paid for is the only thing that cannot be taken away. Marlene never said any of that out loud. She was not a woman who said her own point. She let the roof say it. The brass folding rule still rides in the breast pocket of the olive canvas jacket, worked smooth at the hinge, opened and closed 100 times a day now by her hands. The fat spiral notebook with the cracked red cover rides in the other pocket, its pages gone soft as cloth, every roof still written in it, framing sketched and panels counted and cost to the dollar, because a thing that isn't written down isn't real, and she has never once stopped writing it down. The rule reads the world. The notebook keeps the account of what the world gave up before it was done looking. She carries them both, every day, out to the shed. So here is the only thing I'll ask of you, and then I'll leave you to it. There is a business somewhere near you right now that is paying money to get rid of something. A machine shop with a scrap pile out back. A bottling plant filling a dumpster with what the line kicked out. A wind farm with a laid-on yard full of dead white blades and a disposal quote it dreads to look at. Whatever it is, someone worked it and engineered it and proved it, and it is free or nearly free for one reason only, which is that everyone who owns it has stopped looking at it. Go look at it. You might be done before you've started. Most people are. They glance and they see the obvious thing and they walk off and the story ends there and there is no barn and no roof and no name on any flatbed. But most things get thrown away before anybody's done looking at them. They glance and they walk off and the pile stays a pile. But here is what the drought did to the ones who borrowed to grow. It took them. The rain quit for 2 summers running, the grass browned off, the cattle came off thin the same week the price broke, and men who had signed notes when the animals were fat sold light animals into a falling market to make payments they could no longer make. The auction column in the little paper ran long as an obituary page. Marlene knew most of the names. She had roofed sheds for a good many of them, and the drought did nothing to her. Her grass browned off too. Her father's cattle came off thin and sold cheap, and that hurt. That was real money gone, but she owed nobody anything. She had never signed a note to grow the roofing because there was nothing to borrow against. Her material had cost $1 and a signature. When the market broke, there was no bank with her land in a drawer. The risk that took her neighbors by the throat could not find her because she had never once stood where it could reach. The hard year fed her. Failing operations liquidate, and among the things hauled off were more dead blades from Cimarron Ridge and 2 other wind farms across the line. The disposal problem had only grown, and the farmers who were left did not want a roof they had to finance. They wanted a roof they could pay for on Saturday and never think about again. One afternoon that fall Hollies took the brass folding rule from his barn coat and pushed it across the table. "You use it more than I do now," he said. That was all. She put it in her pocket and has carried it every day since. The operation came out of the hard year bigger than it went in. Then the outside world found her. A materials trade writer came out in a rental car and after him a farm magazine. The writer pressed her on whether the roofs would last 200 years. She would not say it. Light, strong, rust-proof, she told him. Edges capped or they wick water and fail. Durable and paid for. Not 2 centuries because no one could certify that and she would not pretend. He wrote it the way she said it. An invitation came on heavy paper to speak in a hotel ballroom to a few hundred strangers. She nearly declined. "Most things get thrown away before anybody's done looking at them," Holly said from the end of the table. "Don't throw away a room full of people." She went. She was standing in that ballroom the year her niece first drove out, 26 and an engineer, dark ash blonde hair and a level look, a laptop over her shoulder and a fresh notebook in her hand. Her idea built on everything Marlene had done and reached past it, accelerated weathering, pull tests, a documented service life to fill the hole where the 200 years had been. The thing Marlene never had instruments for. Marlene said yes. Clean the first time, no 2 days of waiting because she remembered exactly the thin ache of that. "Most things get thrown away," she told the girl before anybody's done looking at them. The girl wrote it down. The roof is still up there. She hauled home 30 dead blades. They called it a fine waiting to happen. The hail came. The metal roofs dented. The fiberglass held. Now go look at what your town is paying to bury. You might be the only one still looking.